Something broke on April 25th, 2026. Not bent, not strained, not under pressure, broken. And the moment it broke, the entire world got a look at exactly where the power in this conflict actually sits, and it is not in Tehran. Here is what happened. Pakistani officials announced that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had just left Islamabad. Within minutes, not hours, minutes, President Trump posted on Truth Social, cancelling the planned White House envoy trip to Pakistan. No warning, no diplomatic courtesy call, no quiet back-channel signal. He pulled the plug publicly, in real time, while the Iranian delegation was still in the air. But here is the part that tells you everything you need to know about Iran's position right now. Within 10 minutes of that cancellation, Iran produced a new proposal, a better one. Trump himself said it, standing on the tarmac before boarding Air Force One. Immediately when I cancelled it, within 10 minutes, we got a new paper that was much better. 10 minutes. That is not the behavior of a nation negotiating from strength. That is the behavior of a country that is running out of time and knows it. This is the Iran crisis of 2026. This is the US-Iran standoff, and what is actually happening right now is something no single news cycle has had the patience to explain fully. That changes today. If you have been following this story and you understand what is at stake, not just for the Middle East, but for global energy markets, for American foreign policy, for what happens when the world's most powerful navy decides to physically lock a country out of the global economy, then you already know this channel is where you need to be. Subscribe right now, hit the notification bell, because what comes next in this crisis will move fast, and you will not want to be catching up from behind. Let's start with the thing that most coverage has completely failed to convey with the seriousness it deserves. On April 13, 2026, a United States naval blockade of Iranian ports took full effect. Not a sanctions regime, not a diplomatic pressure campaign, not a strongly worded statement from the State Department, a physical naval blockade. 3 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups deployed simultaneously, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the USS George H.W. Bush, forming a triangle of military force spanning the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the approaches from the Indian Ocean. 10 destroyers, 2 marine assault ships, a surveillance architecture that includes satellites, E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft, AWACS planes, and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft that can digitally fingerprint every single vessel operating anywhere in that region. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed it publicly on April 15th. The blockade had been fully implemented, completely cutting off Iran's international sea trade, achieved in under 36 hours of active enforcement. Read that again, 36 hours. The most important maritime choke point on the planet, sealed in a day and a half. Before this conflict, 138 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That strait moves 20% of the world's daily oil and LNG supply. It is not a regional artery, it is a global one. And as of April 13th, Washington physically controls it, not legally, not diplomatically, physically. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers accompanying those carrier groups are not sitting there as a show of force for television cameras. They are running continuous Aegis radar coverage over the entire operational area, tracking hundreds of simultaneous aerial targets, and they are doing it around the clock. F-35C Lightning II aircraft and FA-18 Super Hornets flying off those carrier decks have established complete air superiority within CENTCOM's area of responsibility. This is not a deterrent posture. This is a strangulation architecture. It was designed not to threaten action, but to make action unnecessary, because the physical control of the maritime space is already so total that no countermove by Iran at sea is militarily viable. 39 cargo ships and tankers have already been turned back by American destroyers. One boarding operation was conducted on April 28th by Special Operations Units attached to the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, the commercial vessel MV Blue Star 3, exhibiting suspicious behavior in the Arabian Sea. Cargo examined, route verified, no violations, vessel permitted to proceed. But every shipping company on Earth, every tanker operator, every oil buyer in every port city from Shanghai to Rotterdam received the message without ambiguity. Washington now controls these waters. You will be watched, you may be boarded, and if you are in violation, you will be turned back. Full stop. Now here is the part that almost nobody in mainstream coverage has spent serious time on, and it matters enormously to understanding why Iran's military options are essentially zero. Beneath the surface of the water, an entirely separate technological war is being fought simultaneously. Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines, some of the quietest, most lethal underwater platforms ever constructed by any nation in human history, are conducting continuous mine-sweeping and intelligence operations around the Strait of Hormuz. Advanced sonar networks are recording and analyzing every acoustic trace in the region in real time. Autonomous underwater vehicles are working in coordinated patterns to detect, map, and neutralize any mine-laying attempts before the mines can even be positioned. CENTCOM has been explicit about its rules of engagement. If Iran is laying mines or otherwise threatening American commercial shipping or US forces, those threats will be shot to destroy. No hesitation, no warning. Think about what this actually means for Iran's strategic playbook. For 4 decades, the Islamic Republic's most powerful asymmetric tool in the Gulf has been mine warfare. Iran has an estimated stockpile of more than 5,000 mines, and the entire doctrine built around deploying them was designed around one critical assumption: covert deployment. The strategy depends on getting mines into the water at night, from fast speedboats, in the shallow thermocline complex waters of the Strait, creating an invisible kill zone that makes commercial transit practically and legally impossible before anyone can respond. That doctrine has now been surgically removed from Iran's options list. Virginia-class sonar networks, operating in passive mode, generating zero electromagnetic emissions that could be detected or jammed, remove the covert dimension entirely. Every acoustic signature in the operational zone is recorded. A mine-laying speedboat that enters the detection radius is identified before it completes its mission. That is not theoretical deterrence. That is a physical capability that has fundamentally changed the mine warfare calculus in the Strait of Hormuz in ways the IRGC's planners never anticipated when they built that doctrine. The fast attack boat fleets that the IRGC once presented as its primary asymmetric equalizer, the swarm doctrine, designed to overwhelm a superior conventional force through sheer numbers and unpredictability, are struggling to leave their bases. The entire speedboat doctrine was built on a single assumption that a great power would hesitate to respond to a swarm of small boats for fear of the escalation optics. That assumption has now collided with a military posture that carries no such hesitation, and the doctrine has lost. Now let's talk about money. Because if the military picture tells you what Iran cannot do, the economic picture tells you how long Iran can survive doing nothing. According to commodity analytics firm Kepler, confirmed in reporting by Bloomberg and CNBC on April 28th and 29th, Iranian crude oil exports have collapsed by approximately 70% since the blockade took effect. The numbers are not abstract. Before April 13th, Iran was exporting approximately 1.85 million barrels per day. As of late April, that number had fallen to roughly 567,000 barrels per day. The US Central Command announced that the blockade had completely cut off the seaborne trade that powers approximately 90% of Iran's economy. A White House official speaking to CNBC put the daily financial hemorrhage at approximately $500 million per day. The Iranian rial has hit a record low of 1.8 million to the dollar. Storage facilities at Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, was 74% full as of April 20th, and filling at a pace that Carver estimates will exhaust remaining capacity within 12 to 22 days of that date. When storage is full, Iran must cut production, and cutting production means permanent damage to already underfunded, poorly managed, structurally deteriorating oil fields that the regime has never had the capital to properly maintain. Iran's Supreme National Security Council held an emergency meeting to assess the prospect of renewed civil unrest and concluded internally that the economy may not withstand more than 6 to 8 weeks of blockade at current intensity. 6 to 8 weeks. That is not a margin. That is a countdown. This is the moment to make sure you are locked in, because what comes next in this story, the next proposal out of Tehran, Washington's response, the internal Iranian fracture, the oil storage data, is going to move fast. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already. Turn on every notification. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening, not the version that gets 30 seconds on cable news between pharmaceutical ads. This matters, and you deserve the full picture. The diplomatic sequence around the Pakistan talks is not just a news event. It is a window into how Trump is using the architecture of negotiation itself as a pressure instrument. When White House envoy Steve Witkoff sent his list of amendments to Iran's earlier draft proposal, he did something deliberate and calculated. He reinserted the nuclear program as a non-negotiable element of any agreement and required that Iran not move enriched uranium out of its damaged nuclear facilities or restart activity at those sites while talks continued. Iran's response was to revise its position and move closer to American demands. Closer, but not fully there. Iran's core position has remained consistent throughout. Open the strait, lift the blockade, and then address nuclear issues in a separate, later phase. Washington's position has been equally consistent. The nuclear question is the entire reason this conflict exists, and no agreement that fails to address it directly and completely is acceptable under any conditions. When Iran moved toward but did not fully accept Witkoff's amendments, Trump did not respond with counter-proposals. He did not ask for a modified timeline. He cancelled the Pakistan meeting publicly, and Iran produced a better paper in 10 minutes. Trump acknowledged it was better and still rejected it as insufficient. As Axios reported on May 1st, he told reporters in the Oval Office that Iran's leadership was disjointed and that while they had made strides, he was not sure they would ever get there. And then he said something that deserves to be repeated without softening. At this moment, there will never be a deal unless they agree that there will never be nuclear weapons. He told Axios directly, speaking of Iran, "It is time to cry uncle and say we give up." That is not diplomatic language, that is unconditional surrender language. And the fact that Trump deployed it publicly while simultaneously acknowledging he received a better proposal within 10 minutes of his cancellation reveals a strategy of deliberately escalating pressure. At the precise moment, the other side shows flexibility, not to meet in the middle, but to extract maximum concession from a position of total leverage before any relief is offered. The military options have not been removed from the table during this diplomatic phase. Axios reported on April 29th, citing 3 sources with direct knowledge that CENTCOM had prepared a plan for what sources described as a short and powerful wave of strikes against Iranian infrastructure designed to break the negotiating deadlock if diplomacy fails. Trump told Axios he views the blockade as somewhat more effective than bombing as a source of leverage, but he made clear he would consider military action if Iran still refuses to capitulate. The CENTCOM commander attended the April 30th Situation Room meeting along with Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and CIA Director Ratcliffe. Options were presented. No orders were issued, but the planning is current. The threshold for activation is defined entirely by Trump's judgment of whether Iran is moving fast enough. Iran's most desperate external move was sending Foreign Minister Araghchi to St. Petersburg on April 27th to meet with Putin at the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library. The Jerusalem Post reported that Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov described the meeting's significance as hard to overestimate, and yet the actual output was entirely rhetorical. Putin said Russia will do everything that serves your interests and those of all the peoples of the region, a statement that commits to nothing concrete, makes no military pledge, offers no financial package, and changes the calculus of the blockade by exactly 0. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's statements remained within the tight boundaries of diplomatic courtesy. No weapons delivery, no strategic commitment, no announcement of Russian military support. Araghchi returned from Moscow with a warm handshake and empty hands. This is the reality of Iran's Look East doctrine in 2026, the strategic bet made over decades that Russia and China would provide an alternative geopolitical framework capable of substituting for Western market access. That doctrine was always built on a fundamental misreading. Moscow and Beijing were willing to tolerate Iran as a discounted, sanctioned partner during peacetime. They were never willing to commit to Iran as a military ally during a shooting war against the United States. When the cost of that commitment became visible, actual military confrontation, actual naval interdiction, actual sanctions exposure, both partners chose their own economic interests without hesitation and without apology. China's response, in particular, delivered the most devastating diplomatic signal Iran has received throughout this entire conflict. For years, Beijing was purchasing approximately 1.4 million barrels per day of Iranian crude oil, buying it at an $8 to $10 per barrel discount to Brent crude, routing it through a grey market network of tankers and shell companies that circumvented Western sanctions. That trade was the single most important economic lifeline, keeping the Islamic Republic functional despite decades of Western pressure. The US Navy has now physically severed that lifeline. CNBC confirmed it. The blockade has completely stopped Iran's international sea trade, and the tight controls exercised by CENTCOM and Indo-Pacific Command Forces, extending all the way into the Indian Ocean, have crushed the grey market architecture that sustained Iran's oil revenue through every previous sanctions episode. And then China did something that said more than any formal diplomatic statement could have. China evacuated its citizens from Iran. Emergency flights, Chinese diplomats departing. Not a declaration of support, not a military commitment. An evacuation, the physical act of removing your own nationals from a country because you no longer trust its safety or its trajectory. China publicly called the US blockade a dangerous and irresponsible act and demanded the United States end it. China simultaneously got its people out. Those two positions are not contradictory. They are perfectly consistent with Beijing's actual interest, which is stable global energy trade, not Iranian regime survival. The UAE ramped up oil production with no OPEC ceiling. Legal, stable, reliable Gulf crude is now available at scale. China faces a binary decision: continue purchasing sanctioned, risky, physically blockaded Iranian oil from a country in active military and economic collapse, or shift to Gulf alternatives that carry zero sanctions exposure and that the United States has actively encouraged. For Beijing, that is not a difficult calculation. Iran's final major customer is walking away, not because of Western diplomatic pressure, but because rational self-interest has been reoriented by the simple arithmetic of supply availability. Venezuela, Brazil, and other alternative producers have also ramped up export capacity in coordination with US diplomatic frameworks, effectively closing the last remaining alternative market channels Iran might have used to sustain revenue. South American production increases combined with Gulf alternatives have produced what one analysis accurately described as a flawless diplomatic checkmate, isolating Iran from the global energy system with a completeness that even the most aggressive previous sanctions regime never achieved, because those regimes depended on political compliance from third-party buyers. This blockade depends on physical naval control. You cannot route around a carrier strike group. Inside Iran, what is happening is not a government under pressure. It is an institution entering the terminal phase of a coherence crisis. The IRGC, the organization that made the decisions that started this confrontation, that controls the weapons, the prisons, and the nuclear program, is attempting to consolidate decision-making authority under its own command by sidelining the civilian government. Secretary Rubio confirmed this directly in his Fox News interview. This concentration of power is not a sign of institutional strength. It is the first visible fracture in a state apparatus that can no longer maintain a unified command structure under the simultaneous weight of military defeat, economic suffocation, and internal political disintegration. The IRGC's operational commanders are watching their capabilities erode faster than their political authority can compensate for. Fast attack boats cannot leave port without entering the visual range of a carrier strike group's aerial surveillance network. Shore-launched anti-ship missiles sit on their launchers under continuous satellite observation, with every activation sequence monitored and with the understanding that any launch initiation would trigger immediate 35C preemptive strikes before the launch sequence could complete. The asymmetric warfare toolkit the IRGC spent 4 decades developing, the doctrine it marketed as Iran's equalizer against superpower military force, has been exposed, in the most operationally unambiguous way possible, as insufficient against an adversary that has removed the hesitation variable from its own decision-making calculus entirely. The internal fracture this produces is paralyzing. Hardline figures in the military wing label any diplomatic engagement as a sign of weakness. Pragmatists understand that resistance without leverage is not resilience, it is institutional suicide on a slower timeline. Clerical hardliners, motivated by theology that cannot accept the nuclear concession that ending this war requires, are unable to move. Pragmatists who understand they are managing a collapsing state know they have no option but to make that concession eventually. They cannot resolve this contradiction. And Washington is watching the contradiction unfold in real time, applying fresh pressure at every moment of internal Iranian indecision, never allowing the pressure to ease enough for Tehran to find stable internal footing. Iran's demands at the negotiating table, continuation of uranium enrichment, legal guarantees, closure of US military bases, war reparations, a new legal regime for the Strait, find no diplomatic traction whatsoever in an environment where the US Navy controls strategic waters. China is evacuating its nationals, Russia sent the foreign minister home empty-handed, and the oil storage clock is ticking toward forced production shutdowns. These demands are not a negotiating position. They are the public face of a regime that must appear strong to its domestic audience while desperately seeking any possible exit through the back door. The gap between the rhetoric broadcast inside Iran and the revised proposals submitted through Pakistani intermediaries within 10 minutes of a cancellation is the most precise measurement available of how completely the Islamic Republic understands its own situation. Here is what remains when you strip away every layer of diplomatic language and look at the physical facts on the ground and on the water. 3 aircraft carriers, over 200 aircraft, more than 15,000 fully equipped personnel, 27 heavy warships, autonomous underwater vehicles, Virginia-class submarines, continuous aerial surveillance, Aegis radar networks, 39 ships already turned back, all of it maintaining physical control of the waters that supply 20% of the world's daily oil and LNG. Iran's navy has been functionally neutralized, its air force is grounded, its missile manufacturing infrastructure has been structurally struck at multiple simultaneous nodes. Its fast attack boat doctrine has been tested against actual American military posture and lost. Its underwater mine warfare doctrine has been rendered obsolete by technology it cannot counter. Its external allies are sending evacuation flights, not weapons. Its last major oil customer is redirecting purchases to Gulf alternatives. Its cryptocurrency money laundering networks are dissolving under intensified Western intelligence scrutiny. Its foreign currency reserve channels have been systematically monitored and constrained. The Look East doctrine has crumbled to dust in the face of evacuation flights and UAE oil pricing. Iran's red lines, every single one of them, have been redrawn so many times that they no longer function as red lines at all. They function as markers of how far Washington has already advanced. So where does this end? There are 3 possible outcomes, and every honest analyst who is looking at the actual data, rather than performing neutrality for professional comfort, arrives at the same conclusion about all 3 of them. The first outcome, the internal Iranian leadership fracture, produces the concession Washington requires, a verifiable permanent nuclear weapons prohibition before the oil storage crisis forces a disorderly production shutdown that permanently damages the fields and leaves Iran economically crippled for a generation regardless of what happens diplomatically. The second outcome, the regime escalates militarily in a final desperate bid to change the optics, buy time, and provoke a response that might unify the domestic audience behind the flag, which would trigger the CENTCOM strike package that is currently sitting ready and waiting, and which would likely accelerate the institutional collapse it was designed to prevent. The third outcome, the quiet internal collapse continues, IRGC officials blaming the civilian government, civilians blaming the IRGC, pragmatists and hardliners deadlocked until the regime simply ceases to function as a coherent negotiating counterpart, and Washington finds itself dealing not with a government making calculated decisions, but with a fragmenting power structure making no decisions at all, while the economy disintegrates beneath it. Every one of those scenarios ends badly for the Islamic Republic. None of them ends with Iran intact, sovereign over its nuclear program, and free of American military pressure. The only variable, the only genuine open question, is the timeline. This is where we are on May 5, 2026. A naval blockade, unlike anything deployed since the Cold War, physically enforced and operationally total. An Iranian economy hemorrhaging $500 million a day, with oil storage approaching the physical limit that forces production cuts and permanent field damage. An internal Iranian leadership structure fracturing between hardliners who cannot accept reality and pragmatists who cannot yet impose their view on the institution. A diplomatic process being used as a pressure tool rather than a genuine path to bilateral compromise. A CENTCOM strike plan sitting ready if the pressure fails to produce results fast enough. Russia offering warm words and nothing else. China evacuating its citizens while publicly objecting and privately redirecting its oil purchases. The UAE pumping crude outside OPEC ceilings to ensure China has no reason to fight for Iranian oil access. And Trump standing on a tarmac saying Iran got 10 minutes to produce a better proposal after he cancelled the talks, acknowledging the proposal was better, rejecting it as insufficient, and telling the world it is time for Iran to say it gives up. That is not a man negotiating toward a compromise. That is a man who believes with the carrier strike groups, the submarines, the oil storage data, and the evacuation flights as evidence that he does not need to. We will be here tracking every single development as this moves toward its conclusion. The next proposal out of Tehran, Washington's response. The oil storage numbers as they approach the physical limit, the internal Iranian fractures as they widen. Any shift in the military posture that signals a change in the threshold for kinetic action. This is not a story that ends quietly, and it is not a story that the 30-second news cycle will be able to keep up with when the critical moments arrive. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications. Share this with everyone you know who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the world in 2026. Not the sanitized version, not the performatively balanced version, but the real version grounded in physical facts, economic data, and military reality. The Islamic Republic is running out of time, running out of money, running out of allies, and running out of options. The only question this moment is answering in real time, every single day, is whether the regime finds the internal coherence to accept Washington's terms before the system breaks underneath them. That answer is coming, and when it does, you will want to have been paying attention.